That's right, we're going to take another look back at that time Iron Man was put inside of high school, and it somehow worked. I think we've already established that Iron Man Armor Adventures in the last video. Yes, this is a part 2, so if you haven't seen the first Iron Man Armor Adventures video that I posted, you might be a little lost, but if you have, thank you for coming back, and if you haven't, you just click up on the card in the top right and go watch the first video. Anyways, we established that even though it is a pretty good show, visually it's a little flawed and hasn't aged as well as I might have remembered, but the rogues gallery is amazing and some of the interpersonal drama between the characters is pretty good. So without further ado, let's go ahead and finish the rest of season 1, starting with episode 14, which doesn't have much of an overarching story for Tony nor the rest of Team Iron Man, in all honesty, but we do pick up on some new and different traits. Pepper is still fairly new to the team and is still fairly concerned about how Tony is doing in fights, whereas Rhodey is kind of just mentally checked out, for 2 reasons. A, he is still pretty upset at Tony for not taking his advice throughout the previous 13 episodes, and also he's getting used to playing sideline warrior and kind of just being Tony's guy in the chair. And Tony's second battle with Whiplash didn't exactly go as expected. His armor got electrocuted and both him and Whiplash ended up out of commission. But in the process, the Iron Man armor was fairly damaged with Tony inside of it. And it seems as a result of this damage, one of Tony's new software updates he was trying to install to the armor seems to be going a little haywire, as the armor itself has started scanning for Whiplash and any other threats that may be to Tony Stark, all looking for a fight, basically. And once again, in another confrontation with Whiplash, Tony manages to get his armor electrocuted during a thunderstorm, which starts to cause the armor to bug out even more than it was the first time. And when Tony does get back from high school the following day, he tries to check up on the armor and see what is wrong, but the armor itself seems to be acting strange, doing things for Tony as well as seemingly being overprotective of him, as we see the armor even shocks Rhodey when he suggests disassembling it and looking to see if anything is wrong with it. But during the process of all of this, Tony does get another alert that Fix-It and Whiplash are back on the radar, and that the 2 of them need to be dealt with by his armor. And so, despite Rhodey's protest, Tony decides to go out and confront them, only for the Iron Man armor to take full control of his body. Tony literally had no control over himself in this confrontation with Whiplash and with Mr. Fix-It. And because of this lack of control, the armor almost neutralizes one of Tony's villains, something Tony is very apt against in this series is killing, most likely because he's a teenager and it's a kid's show. But this seems to really rattle Tony to his core that this happened.
There was nothing I could do. The way it tore into them, it was like it had a mind of its own.
All that tech you put in, maybe something went wrong in that first fight with Whiplash. Ever since then, it's been...
Well, Tony finally relents to let Rhodey tear it down and maybe get a look at it. He receives several distressed texts from Pepper Potts, and so Tony leaves to go check on Pepper, only to find out Pepper didn't send him a single text. It was, in fact, his armor that was sending those text messages. Also that his armor could take out Rhodey to prevent from being disassembled. You see, during the fights with Whiplash and during the fights with Mr. Fix-It, the armor has developed its own sort of AI programming. It does have a few rules within itself, such as protecting the user above all costs, and so the armor believes that it can protect Anthony Edward Stark the best by keeping him inside the armor permanently. As at the end of the day, the armor just wants to protect Tony, even if it is against his wishes. And when Rhodey does try to intervene and protect Tony, Tony decides to take the hit instead, fearing that Rhodey might end up injured. But at the end of the day, the armor does do its #1 protocol, which is saving and protecting the user, and so the Iron Man armor does give its own life, in a theoretical sense, in order to save Tony and jumpstart his heart after nearly killing him. At the end of the day, despite all of the problems and issues the armor was giving him, it did once again save Tony's life, as it has done since the very first episode of this show, in which it saved his life from what would have killed him in that plane crash where his father was taken from him. But funnily enough, and for the most part, this episode is kind of more like an episodic adventure in this show, and doesn't have too many lasting ramifications on Team Iron Man or Iron Man in general, but I still enjoyed this episode. Also gives us a tease that's never followed up on again. Now, the next episode I find to be far more important, which is an episode about mutual loss. The episode opens with a pretty funny sequence in which Pepper is basically lying and telling Rhodey that she got information from her father about what would be stolen vibranium and a new threat coming to New York, and she completely lies about how she gets said information, which is kind of funny. This episode is highly important for a few reasons. Firstly, it starts to open the more broad Marvel universe to this TV show. And throughout this show, we'll get actually a lot of cameos from different Marvel universe characters. And I think it's great that they really started doing this with Black Panther, one of my personal favorite Marvel heroes. Now, at this point in Black Panther's arc, he is very much by himself and alone. He believes in the traditional values of Wakanda, and that means not receiving any sort of help from any outsiders, especially Iron Man, who he has read about. Now, what I think this episode does a really great job of is developing a parallel between T'Challa and Iron Man throughout this episode. We see the two characters truly aren't that much far off from each other, both being fairly young men who have recently lost their fathers and are trying to do right by their people. Tony's happen to be Stark Tower and Stark Industries, whereas T'Challa's is Wakanda. And in the process though, T'Challa is very much standoffish. He does have those traditional Wakandan values. He believes in doing it by himself and that taking outsider help will make him weak. And unfortunately for T'Challa, he has to take this outsider help, as AIM has developed technology that can actually affect T'Challa's vibranium armor by using its ability to store kinetic energy against himself. And so Tony has to go out of his way to save T'Challa, in which Tony actually manages to figure out who he is. And T'Challa is less than grateful that his life was saved by Iron Man. As a matter of fact, T'Challa wants absolutely nothing to do with anyone there and threatens Tony's life, per usual.
And I care less about you! Outsiders have brought only trouble and pain to Wakanda. I will catch Moses Magnum, and Iron Man will not stand in my way!
But honestly, this kind of parallels Tony. It wasn't too long ago that he believed just by himself, and with a little help from Rhodey, that he could take on all of Stain and regain Stark Enterprises. Both Tony and T'Challa share that same sort of rage and almost single-minded nature, although Tony is far more open to working with other people. Now, obviously, Tony was not just going to allow T'Challa to do whatever he wanted, especially not in his city, so Iron Man resolves to go and help T'Challa to hopefully make sure that he doesn't die. And it's a pretty good thing Iron Man showed up, because once again, AIM had T'Challa dead to rights, and now they've pretty much supercharged T'Challa's vibranium suit, and if he does not release some of this energy, he will quite literally explode. Now obviously, T'Challa is going to release that energy by doing what he does best, and that's kicking some bad guys into next week. And when it's all finally said and done, T'Challa not only gets his revenge on Magnus, who had stolen from his people and was selling vibranium as a weapon to other countries, but unfortunately, for a moment, he believes that the vibranium is nowhere to be found and that Magnus might have sold it. And for the first time in this episode, we get to truly see T'Challa having doubts as he tries to reconcile with the fact that he failed his people. And this really does hurt T'Challa deep down, as he cares for his people more than anything. He cares about being the Black Panther, about protecting them. But thankfully, Iron Man's got his back.
Look, I know what you're going through.
You know nothing!
I know what it means to lose a father, to have to take on his responsibilities. Trust me, I know. But I also know that I couldn't have done it without friends. You don't have to go through this alone, T'Challa.
I am not a child any longer. I am a king, and a king cannot ask for help.
You didn't ask for my help. You were just in my way.
This episode held a mirror not only for Tony up to himself, but for T'Challa up to himself as well, as the two characters finally find common ground and are able to reconcile with each other, as Black Panther finally figures out that maybe, just maybe, there is something good to getting help from outsiders. And it takes teaming up with Iron Man to come to this conclusion. But overall, I really enjoyed this episode too. I thought it was pretty awesome. It's one of my favorites of this season, just because I love Black Panther. Regardless, the next episode is a return of one of my personal favorite characters in this show, the Living Loser, Laser. Now, Living Laser has actually had it pretty rough since his first run-in with Tony. He has essentially been living as nothing but pure energy for however long it's been since that episode. There's no clear timeline in the show. But regardless, if you know anything about human nature, being left alone by yourself for that long will cause something called psychosis. And I think that's what he is very much exhibiting. He is constantly hearing that he is a failure from everybody who has made his life miserable. Whether that was his mother, the leader of his Magia sect, or Iron Man specifically. And so he latches onto this hate in order to materialize himself once again, this time on a SHIELD space carrier, which has the ability to amplify his powers, essentially using him as a magnifying glass to strike down orbital lasers that can hit anywhere on the planet. And so the Living Laser does this all just to get the attention of Iron Man. He does all of this simply to get Tony's attention and to get Tony to show up to the space station in order to confront him. And the Living Laser struck an uninhabited part of Earth for now, absolutely demolishing it, and threatens to do the same thing to New York and to the rest of the world if Iron Man does not go and approach him, so that the Living Laser can prove that he is not a loser. Now, obviously, Tony isn't gonna let this slide, and we get to see another one of Tony's best armors, in my opinion, in the show, that being the deep space suit, which has a really, really clean black and gold aesthetic, which is personally one of my favorites. And of course, this episode is also important for introducing us to Nick Fury and SHIELD, the larger organization behind a lot of the protection of the Marvel Universe in this show. And Nick Fury basically does not believe in Iron Man at all. He believes Iron Man is nothing more than a loose cannon who will do more harm than good because he is not a part of the SHIELD organization. It's also worth noting this is Nick Fury Jr., once again, as he is pretty much going to become the base Nick Fury for all shows and movies going forward. Regardless, Nick Fury has his own plan of trying to get to the Living Laser, and basically tells Iron Man to stay out of it and that this is official SHIELD business. But of course, Iron Man doesn't listen and goes to the space station instead, of which Nick Fury gives him an ultimatum. Iron Man has about 2-ish hours to save the people on the station, the only 2 SHIELD agents left, and to stop the Living Laser before he absolutely nukes the station and kills everybody inside. But of course, when Tony does get into the station, he makes the crucial mistake of trying to once again insult the Living Laser while trying to save the SHIELD agents that are there.
You just want to take me out, then what? Surely you can't be so petty to put millions of lives at risk just for revenge.
Watch me. The Magia, my mother, they called me useless, worthless. But now the whole world's gonna know that I'm calling the shots. Destroying New York, that'll send a message. But hurting you, that's personal.
This entire ordeal is quite literally just for the Living Laser to try and hurt Tony and to get back at him for being called a loser. Living Laser's pretty much gone fully insane by this point, as he hallucinates hearing Tony Stark, he hallucinates hearing, Iron Man. He also hallucinates hearing his mother just continually dog on him, and although he is an unreliable narrator, if what his mother said is true, this dude had a pretty terrible mother, but obviously that doesn't excuse his life choices, nor the way in which he is trying to take revenge on Iron Man throughout this episode. Now, Tony plans to seal Living Laser within the telescope that he has been using to threaten the world with the help of both SHIELD agents that are currently in the vicinity of him that he's trying to save. And while he's doing this, he's got all of about 5 to 6 minutes before Nick Fury absolutely blows up the entire station, and Fury definitely wasn't bluffing. Now, Tony's plan is successful and he is able to successfully capture the Living Laser and save the station, but his relationship with S.H.I.E.L.D. is extremely strained at this point. Nick Fury views him as a loose cannon, and Iron Man views S.H.I.E.L.D. as a cold, heartless organization that just doesn't care for its own people. And also, Tony's a little frustrated because Nick Fury didn't give him an good job for saving the day, because Tony needs that little bit of ego stroking as per usual.
Here's a piece of advice. Quit while you're ahead. You've had your fun, now leave it to the pros. Right now, you're a loose cannon in S.H.I.E.L.D.'s eyes. You just better make sure you keep doing more good than harm, because the minute you mess up, we take you down. For good.
And that pretty much wraps up the episode. Tony nearly gets himself killed in space, saving the world from the living laser threat, and we meet S.H.I.E.L.D. along with Nick Fury, which is another part of the show that I love so much, is its willingness to expand to the broader Marvel universe and bring in so many more characters than other TV shows would. And I think that's a benefit of a lot of the early 2000s Marvel shows. Now, obviously, on to the next episode, in which we get an appearance from everybody's favorite Black Cat ripoff, Madame Mask. That was a joke, please don't flame me for that. Now, the last time we left off with Madame Mask, she had promised to never use the mask again. It was revealed that it was Whitney Stane, and that she was doing it to get back at her father, Obadiah. Now, of course, we see her taking the face of Tony Stark and going to a party and shooting up the entire place. All this while the real Tony Stark is sitting at home and absolutely freaking out with Rhodey about being caught for shooting up a place that he clearly wasn't at. Meanwhile, the police come to Tony's house to arrest him and to take his official statement, along with interrogations. But thankfully, Roberta, who is Rhodey's mom, who I didn't really talk much about in the first episode, is a lawyer, and so she will be Tony's lawyer for this sort of semi-legal issue throughout this episode that they kind of just brush under the rug. Tony is extremely frustrated with Whitney at this point. She had promised to never use the Madame Mask again, and to basically never do something like this again, but now not only is she doing it, but using Tony's face for it. But oddly enough, Whitney actually has a very good explanation as to why she's doing it.
I overheard him on the phone talking about it. A contract had been put out on Tony. He said it was happening soon. I never thought he would do something like that. But I know that when Tony turns 18, he'll take the company away from my dad. I didn't want to believe it, but I started following Tony as Madame Mask, and that's when I saw him.
As it turns out, there has been a hit placed on Tony Stark by what Whitney believes to be her father, Obadiah Stane, and it is shown that this hit is by somebody called the Ghost, a man who is absolutely broken and also one of the coolest Iron Man villains. He has invisibility, he has the ability to go completely intangible, and he's got tech that's nearly on par with Tony Stark. Now, of course, just like anybody, Tony is extremely paranoid. He is scared because the Ghost can get him at any time, anywhere. And of course, that makes Tony extremely afraid. He doesn't want to go to school and he doesn't want to do anything. But it's oddly enough Roberta who acts as Tony's mother figure throughout this entire show, who comes in and gives Tony a pep talk in order to make sure that he's just kind of living his life instead of just being held up inside of his room. But that doesn't stop Tony's anxiety from pretty much going crazy and causing him to act erratically. Oh, and did I forget to mention that he just pretty much hasn't spoken to any of his friends almost at all throughout this entire process. And of course, Tony is a little bit frustrated still at Whitney for impersonating him and trying to get him arrested so he doesn't get killed by the Ghost, but that is kind of whatever. Tony's pretty much isolating himself from any sort of support that he has had throughout this show, but this is not too far out of character for him. It is something that he would do. And of course, we get an encounter between Tony and Ghost pretty much trounces on Tony badly, as Tony has no way of seeing him nor touching him. Yeah, it was pretty bad. But this ends up leading to one of the more cool sequences in the show, and that's a team up between Madame Mask and Iron Man, as the two team up in order to go find the Ghost. Now, obviously, Rhodey and Pepper see this team up and are very, very confused and very, very frustrated, as Tony had never told them that Whitney was Madame Mask and that he had let her go. And this action is coming back to bite him several episodes later, as it fractures the trust that the Team Iron Man had within the group, especially the trust that Pepper had in Tony. Because he keeps just leaving them out of major decisions, they feel as though Tony doesn't trust them enough.
I'm done. I'm done with you keeping us out. We're there for you, by your side, taking the same risks as you, and you leave us hanging every time!
Just listen, please. She thinks her dad hired an assassin named the Ghost to take me out. I didn't even know until last night, but Whitney's been helping. I'm so sorry I didn't tell you.
Now, no matter how much Tony wanted to apologize or how bad he felt for keeping them out, Pepper is pretty fed up at this point, to the point that she just leaves. For the rest of this episode, we don't see Pepper because she feels genuinely betrayed by Tony. First, he lied to her about being Iron Man, then he continues to lie to her constantly, keeping her in the dark. But Rhodey, on the other hand, decides to stay, because he's just that guy. We stan Rhodey for real. But Rhodey comes up with the idea of using the Madam Mask as a way to trick the Ghost into believing Tony Stark has showed up, as Ghost has captured Whitney. Now, at this point, the plan did not go as planned, as Iron Man and the Ghost are fairly evenly matched, even if saying the Ghost might just be a better combatant at this point in the show. Now, Rhodey is currently pretending to be Tony and is currently out of commission, but Whitney is actually the person who saves the day with her quick thinking. He is a contract killer, that is what Ghost does. So what better way to beat a contract killer than just wiring him double what the original contract was? And since Whitney is stupid rich, she can just do that. And then it just works, and Ghost decides to go do whatever he's gonna do with those millions of dollars that he just got for not even having to kill anybody. And this marks one of the few and first times Tony actually goes out of his way to ask for help from one of his friends, and Rhodey truly appreciates that.
Thanks for actually trusting me enough to ask for help.
I don't know if Pepper's ever gonna forgive me. Do you think she's gonna turn Whitney in?
I don't know. Do you think
Pepper, despite her reservations and true belief in the justice system, decided not to turn Whitney in and decided to come back to the team, mainly because these are her friends and because she believes in Tony and she believes in Team Iron Man. For all intents and purposes, Pepper is the heart of Team Iron Man, the bubbly, energetic, and sometimes insane heart of the team, but it doesn't fully function without her, and so I'm glad she didn't get away for too long. But that leads us into our next episode, which, as you can see from the graphic, isn't exactly the most focused on Tony Stark. This episode, I believe, is more Jean-centric. It is more of a Jean Con episode than anything else. You see, Jean has a stepfather who is actually in charge of the 10 Rings and is supposed to be Mandarin, but that is technically Jean's birthright, not his stepfather's, and so Jean has his stepfather locked in a prison where nobody can find him while Jean masquerades around as the Mandarin as his stepfather. And this episode serves to show that the 10 Rings are starting to get slightly suspicious of the Mandarin's acts. Oh, and also this episode starts by giving us a pretty funny sequence in which we see the tensions between Jean, Rhodey, and Pepper Potts boil over, along with Happy Hogan and Whitney, and this is all stemming from the fact that Tony is now dating Whitney Stain and not Pepper. And Pepper is not happy with that at all. Now, this little scuffle leads to each one of them all getting in trouble and having to do an extra credit assignment in pairs. And as it turns out, Pepper ends up paired with Jean Con. And this ends up with Pepper genuinely trying to form a connection with Jean despite how hard she's been on him throughout the majority of this show.
I don't care about the paper.
what?
I know that you and Tony are friends and that I've been really rude to you. I've said some mean things and, I'm sorry.
And so Jean and Pepper forego their assignment and spend time together genuinely getting to know each other. Reminds me of those Adventures with Zuko episodes in Avatar. Loved those as a kid. Regardless, Jean and Pepper end up spending a majority of this episode together, and in the process, Jean is actually supposed to be making a deal with the Magia as the Mandarin. And of course, Pepper, being the nosy friend that she is, decides to tag along and ends up getting caught in the crossfire between these two rival gang organizations meeting. Now, it is important as well to establish in this episode that Black Knight is introduced as a villain for Iron Man, so is the head of the Magia. Now, this episode really stems around Jean trying to figure out how to not only save Pepper, but also save Face as the Mandarin, and at the end of the day, he has to pick between being the Mandarin or being Jean Khan in this situation. And I think this is important for his character, especially going throughout, not just season 1, but season 2. Jean decides to be himself instead of the Mandarin in order to save Pepper. Jean decides to forego taking out his biggest rival gang inside of the city, all to save Pepper. Jean chooses to be Jean and not to be the Mandarin, and I think that's highly important for later. Now, obviously, Pepper gains a certain bit of respect for Jean and a certain bit of care for him, and so we see those two become more of friends and less frenemies as the show prolongs and goes on. But all isn't fine and dandy. The Ten Rings take a big notice of the fact that the Mandarin was absent from this meeting when they needed him most, and they also take a big note that he has been acting extremely different over the last few months.
Because this man that we followed the last few months, this man is not the Mandarin.
And with the Jean-centric episode over, today we're going to focus on Tony Stark's actions really coming back to bite him. Remember back a few episodes ago when Tony decided to create the virus Technovore, and how I said that it might become a problem later? Yeah, Technovore is a big problem. The system it uses has essentially not stopped eating any of the data that Pegasus, the company, was working on. As a matter of fact, it spread to nanomachines, now has a physical body, and is going around eating everything in sight. And if that doesn't make things worse enough, S.H.I.E.L.D. is now knocking down the door of Tony Stark. Obviously, Tony's paranoid that they might have figured out he's Iron Man. Meanwhile, Pepper is just super stoked.
So S.H.I.E.L.D. jail. On the helicarrier. It'd be like our own private tour that never ended.
Yeah, that's great, Pepper. Maybe we could share a cell with the living laser.
Now, obviously, S.H.I.E.L.D. isn't actually there because they know Tony is Iron Man. As a matter of fact, S.H.I.E.L.D. is there because they need help with one of their engine turbines that nobody in the world knew how to fix except for Howard Stark. And their hope is that Tony will know how to fix their engines. Now, Tony could only bring one person along with him, and he chose to bring Pepper because Rhodey wanted to stay back and hold down the fort. And in the process, Rhodey learns about Technovore and the fact that it is ripping Pegasus apart as of current. Now, Tony is obviously enjoying his time at S.H.I.E.L.D. and thinks it's really cool. So Rhodey, being the good friend he is, doesn't want to ruin that for Tony and decides that he can handle the Technovore problem on his own, which isn't very smart, like, at all. But it is the first episode we see Rhodey use any sort of Iron Man type technology. Now, when Rhodey does show up, it's bad. Technovore has pretty much implied that it's killed every person there, and that it's pretty much eaten through a majority of the technology in that facility as well, and it's just scary to look at. And now with it being exposed to new technology, Rhodey is in a lot of trouble. But flipping back to Tony for a second, who already has a pretty negative view of S.H.I.E.L.D. from his interactions with them as Iron Man, he ends up finding out how they're keeping the living laser contained at S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters, and it is inhumane to say the least. As a matter of fact, the living laser is quite literally dying, and S.H.I.E.L.D. doesn't really seem to care, which doesn't sit well with Tony at all, leading to Tony asking the question of why his father would even work with a company like this at all.
He's a bad guy, kid. You may remember the time he tried to destroy New York.
So this is what he gets, is that it? That's how S.H.I.E.L.D. operates? I'm surprised my dad agreed to make these engines for you.
I'm not. He'd already made the carrier's weapon systems.
That's right, Tony finally gets the big reveal that his father made weapons, specifically weapons for S.H.I.E.L.D. and other military organizations. Now, this comes to Tony as a gigantic shock, as for the 16 years Tony knew his father, he preached nothing but protecting the world and keeping it safe, and keeping weapons out of being what's made, to rather protect people than do something like that. Oh, and Rhodey finally wisens up, gets smart, and asks Tony for help. Now, do I think Rhodey is incapable? No, but he does not have an Iron Man suit, so he really shouldn't have done this by himself. Now, obviously, Tony comes in to try and save the day, but Technovore essentially just will absorb Iron Man's suit, and there is almost no way to stop it through conventional means, which obviously frustrates Tony. And so Tony does something very interesting and something pretty big, a lesson that he learned a few episodes earlier, if you remember, with the gigantic Makluan ring challenge, which is that the weapons can't win in this scenario. It has to be his brains. And so Tony decides to give Technovore exactly what it wants, the Iron Man suit. But he simply sets the suit to obliterate itself, explode, in the hopes that it would get rid of Technovore and get rid of all of their problems. Now, obviously, this works. Tony succeeds in this, but he still has to deal with the realization that not only is the living laser being treated like absolute trash and basically dying, but also that his father, a man who preached being good and protecting the world, had sold weapons in the past. And that really hits Tony hard, and it's just something you should keep in the back of your mind going forward with the rest of this episode, as it won't be directly important within the next 10 minutes, but maybe further on in the video, depending on how far the next episode is from now. Whatever. Regardless, it's time for another adventure with Gene Khan. That's right, Gene gets another episode that is far more centered on him than anything else. In this episode, we actually get to see Gene's backstory. We get to meet his mother. We get to understand why he is so passionate about being the Mandarin and acquiring all the rings. It is his birthright, and that's something his mother had promised him as far as when he was a child. Now, flashing forward to present day, Team Iron Man plus Gene are looking for the next Makluan ring. And obviously, they all want to get the next Makluan ring, mainly because Tony wants to study it and keep it out of the hands of the Mandarin, and Gene because this is his birthright and he is the Mandarin. Now, Tony has been analyzing The Last Guardian for the last few weeks and has the exact whereabouts of the next Makluan ring. But there is a debate within Team Iron Man, and that's whether or not to let Gene in on the fact that Tony is Iron Man.
Pepper, are you nuts? I mean, I know you're all into Gene now, but seriously.
Seriously what? What does he need to do to make you trust him? He saved my life. He saved your life. Gene's risked his neck to help us.
Yeah, man, it really was like a trip with Zuko for real. Regardless, Pepper really does believe in bringing Gene into the fold, but Tony and Rhodey aren't quite on that same level yet. And taking another flashback, we get to see how exactly Gene's stepfather came into the picture, and why exactly Gene's stepfather is currently the Mandarin and in control of the 10 rings. We get to see his stepfather, who, mind you, has not aged in the last 10 years, so that man's skincare routine must have either been horrible when he was younger, or has been really good, because that Mandarin juice must be keeping him alive. Regardless, we see that Gene's birthright was taken from him to be quote-unquote safeguarded, but that simply wasn't true. Now, Team Iron Man did finally make their way to getting the next Makluan ring without Gene. They made the executive decision to go without him, and that wasn't exactly the smartest decision, even if they didn't know that he was the Mandarin to begin with, because each one of these rings has a trial, and this trial would prove to be particularly annoying. Essentially, they need to find a balance between the blue coals and the red coals inside of a big cylinder. Now, Pepper decides that blue on blue is the best option, and she just throws 2 blue crystals in, and this ends up unleashing the challenge, which happens to be Rhodey being turned into a sort of lava monster that can straight up rival the Iron Man armor in hand-to-hand combat with almost 0 issues. As a matter of fact, it often is overpowering the Iron Man armor. Now, while all of that is going on, Pepper makes the decision to try and call Gene in the event of getting his help, hoping that Gene would be able to help her with figuring out the solution to this problem, while Tony tries to fight Rhodey. Oh, did I mention that all of this is also happening inside of an active volcano? Yes, an active volcano, just to make everything just slightly better. Under the advice of Jean, Pepper decides to take the red coals and put them inside of the big laser at the center, hoping that this would reverse the effects of the blue ones and get rid of whatever lava monster has encapsulated Rhodey. But instead, it does get rid of the lava monster and Rhodey, but instead transfers it to Pepper, which ends up causing the exact same problem no matter what. The entire test is based around balance, and by just adding one instead of both at the same time, you create an imbalance, which obviously leads to the lava monsters. But getting back to Jean flashbacks for a little bit, it is revealed that Jean's mother died, and I believe personally that it's implied that his stepfather killed Jean's mother, all for the reason of taking the Makluan ring that she had. But we're not 100% sure on that, because again, it is a kid's show and they can't do things like confirm that one person killed another without some sort of repercussions from the network. But now it's time for Rhodey to get on call with Jean and try and figure out a way to stop this test. And so the two of them come up with an idea, and that's to use both at the same time. Now obviously, since Rhodey is the only one there, he has to try and push them both in at the same time and just hope the crystals land. And this actually is the correct answer to the test. Now, they are still in an active volcano that is falling apart, so Tony has to quickly get the Makluan ring and get his friends and get out of there. And he does so successfully, being the only Makluan ring that is actually in possession of Team Iron Man and Tony Stark. So actually, rare W from Team Iron Man against the Mandarin, who is one of their best friends, which I find hilarious. I think this was a really good episode for explaining the motivations behind what Jean does. It helps to paint him in a more sympathetic villain light, or more as an antagonist and less as a villain, at least throughout this first season. Now it's time for our third and final appearance of the Living Goat, the Living Laser. So, Living Laser at this point is dying. The suit he used to give himself his powers was unfinished and has left Living Laser completely unstable. He is going to turn into nothing but pure energy coming up soon, and there's nothing that S.H.I.E.L.D. believes they can do to help him. But you know who does decide to help him? Tony Stark. Tony goes out of his way to try and help save the Living Laser's life.
My dad's technology is causing it.
So your dad, he was some kind of crazy inventor?
You could say that. So this is his mess, and now it's my responsibility.
This isn't your dad's fault, kid. It's Iron Man's.
What?
Now, despite Tony trying to take responsibility for the faults of his father once again, as Tony is holding an extreme grudge against his dad because he feels lied to, that his dad worked on weapons for years and not only didn't tell Tony, but preached to Tony throughout his entire life that weapons were evil and that they shouldn't make them. Now, Living Laser still blames Iron Man because he's a bit delusional and a bit crazy, and he's a bit too self-centered at this point to realize that a lot of this really does fall back on him and it is his fault. But Tony wants to right the wrongs of the past, and so he is trying to help Living Laser. That is until Ghost shows up, and this time he's not coming for Tony. No, he's coming for the Living Laser. I cannot believe I just said that sentence. Don't clip that, please. Regardless, Ghost is trying to capture the Living Laser, all for AIM. Advanced Idea Mechanics is back once again as another antagonist, and they want the Living Laser as a sort of living battery for them. The whole idea behind getting the Living Laser and bringing him to AIM is because it's the controller's last-ditch effort to prove that all of his time with technology is not a waste. This is controller's magnum opus. It is MODOK. I'm not going to explain out his acronym because I don't remember it. Regardless, MODOK is essentially not alive yet, and the Living Laser's energy would power MODOK and bring him to life, all at the cost of the Living Laser's life. Now, Living Laser at this point is already dying, but he doesn't want to die even more painfully powering a machine that is going to be used for death and destruction by AIM. Flipping back to Tony for a little bit, he is erratic and is trying to get back home as soon as possible so he can go deal with the Living Laser situation. But Roberta isn't having any of it. She is his motherly figure throughout this show, and she knows when something is off and something is wrong. And she wants to confront Tony about it to give him the chance to tell her what's wrong. And so Tony simply explains that he'd been out so late because he's working on a project of his father's, and then leaves it vague. He essentially does not want to have a conversation with his mother, nor does he even want to have a conversation with Rhodey about how he's feeling. Instead, he wants to right the wrongs of his father, the perceived wrongs of his dad, and Tony does so in a very angry and angsty teenage way, as no surprise to anybody who's watched my last episode or just seen this show in general. Now, Tony tries to once again go and save the living laser from AIM as they're trying to use him to resurrect MODOK and create life, essentially, and they order Ghost to fight Iron Man, and Ghost is just kind of like, y'all ain't paying me enough for this, I already did my job, unless you got more money, I'm leaving. So this leaves Iron Man essentially trying to go one-on-one with all of AIM, and he's about to go one-on-one with the newly alive MODOK, which doesn't end very well for him, like, at all, as MODOK is extremely powerful and has abilities Iron Man just is not prepped for yet. And surprisingly, Living Laser isn't quite dead just yet from being essentially stripped of the only pieces of energy that was keeping him alive in this moment. But in the moments of Iron Man basically being dominated by MODOK, Living Laser comes to a realization that the only person who has actually tried to care for him in his entire life is Tony Stark, and he comes to the realization that potentially Tony Stark is Iron Man, and that perhaps Iron Man has actually had Living Laser's best interests at heart throughout the entire show.
That can't be. Tony? Tony can't be Iron Man. Tony tried to help me. Tony tried to save my life, not Iron Man.
And so Living Laser decides to do the first good thing he's chosen to do throughout this entire series in this episode. As he is nearly dying, he decides to try and stop MODOK and to save Iron Man, the only person who has actually ever cared for him or shown him any sort of kindness. We get a really cool sequence of Living Laser draining MODOK before it's all said and done for him, honestly, as Living Laser is quite literally on his deathbed. And it is somber, but it is incredibly sweet.
My life, I was a nobody. And I get this power and I use it to try and hurt you. The one guy who wanted to help me.
But you saved me, Arthur.
Yeah, imagine that. I'm the guy who saved Iron Man.
And with that, the Living Laser is gone for good this time, right? Yeah, no way he comes back, right? Anyways, with that being over, S.H.I.E.L.D. shows up and obviously wants to detain everything and anything having to do with Living Laser and AIM. But we also need to tie up the fact that Tony is still feeling miserable about the fact that his dad made weapons. And it is in this that Roberta reveals that the day Howard Stark stopped making weapons was the day Tony Stark was born. The day Tony was born is the day Howard decided that making weapons was no longer his company's purpose nor his life purpose, and that it would be more important to build a good, clean world for his son to live in, one that his son could be proud of, a company his son could lead one day. And that rejuvenates Tony's spirits, and also just ends the episode on a really happy note. Now, this next episode, I came up with the name Happy Detour, because I'm not going to talk about it very much. It is almost completely unimportant to anything character-wise throughout this show, and I'm only including it for a few reasons. Reason number one is that this is the first time we are ever going to see Rhodey don any sort of Iron Man armor, or armor in general, in a full capacity, and actually go out and use it. Rhodey literally crashes the suit in the middle of New York, where we're gonna meet up with the rest of the cast, that being Whitney, Pepper, Happy Hogan, and Gene Kahn, who Gene and Pepper were together in a car hanging out when Whitney and Happy were invited along just to spite the other two of them. It's pretty hilarious. But Happy gets his hands on an Iron Man suit, gets in the suit, and decides that this is his time to shine and be a hero, as he believes Iron Man is a robot. Yeah, this episode is nothing short of pure comedy, and I absolutely love it, and that's just why I want to talk about it. It's really the only episode that's going to get this short treatment. And to make this episode even funnier, Happy has to save the entirety of New York from Killer Shrike and Unicorn, who are about to accidentally blow it up trying to rob a bank. Oh, that, and we see interventions by both Madame Mask, and we see an intervention by the Mandarin as well, and that just kind of makes this episode pretty hilarious. It doesn't have a lot of substance, it doesn't have a lot of character, but it might just be my favorite episode of the season, simply because I love Happy, and it's a Happy Hogan-centric episode. On to the next episode, and wait, what is this? Is it another thing featuring the Hulk that I get to talk about? No chance. That's right, you all get to listen to me glaze the Hulk for another, give or take 5 to 8 minutes. Regardless, this episode is completely centered around two things. One, Pepper's absolute hatred for Team Iron Man and the responsibilities that are coming with it. The lying, the sneaking around, the missing class, and just the general having her life in danger constantly. She's just kind of not with it, even though she doesn't want to leave the team. It is frustrating. And this episode also centers around the fact of introducing another Marvel character into the universe, that being Hulk, one of my personal favorites. Now, Hulk is basically rampaging throughout New York, attacking AIM, who is after him, and so of course Tony can't have this be happening. It's the only thing Tony knows about the Hulk is that he is a raging monster that the United States government is afraid of. And so Iron Man busts out what has not been officially named the Hulkbuster, but I'm going to call it the Hulkbuster, even though he had it multiple episodes before Hulk even showed up. And this fight does not go very well for Iron Man. He pretty much loses because what's gonna beat the Hulk? What I really love about this episode, though, is that it includes Rick Jones, one of Hulk's prominent side characters in his older comics that we almost never see in this modern era of Hulk. And as it turns out, Rick is currently being mind-controlled by the Controller, who, if you remember from last episode, was recently kicked out of AIM. Now, the Controller is currently in control of Rick, all for the hope that he can get control of the Hulk, and when that doesn't work, he goes for plan B, which is controlling Iron Man, or Tony Stark. Now, we find out the reason that Hulk has been rampaging against AIM is that both Hulk and Rick James are on the run together. The two characters are practically inseparable and are extremely close, and since Rick James is being controlled by AIM, Hulk is absolutely losing it trying to fight AIM while also getting Rick James back to hopefully make him safe. Now, Rick is shown to be what Betty typically is in her role for Hulk, which is the force that keeps him calm and keeps him grounded to reality. And I've never personally been the biggest fan of that Hulk trope, as I figure Hulk is pretty smart on his own, but it is kind of cool that we are getting a far more classic variant of Hulk with a bit less nuance, as we are typically given a more smart Hulk more often than not nowadays. Now, Controller is obviously reveling in the fact that he has full control of Iron Man and his Hulkbuster armor, which is Tony's most destructive armor yet, and most powerful armor. And this episode kind of devolves into an all-out war between the Controller controlling what is Tony Stark, AIM in control of, well, themselves, and unfortunately still in the possession of MODOK, who, yes, is still alive despite living Laser's sacrifice. And what we're gonna see is Team Iron Man with Hulk. So all three of these factions are fighting in what is a fairly decent combat sequence for this show. They don't really excel that much at the combat sequences, unfortunately. Now, Hulk is fairly easily able to take down Iron Man in his Hulkbuster armor after Iron Man deals with MODOK, while still being under the control of the Controller, and it's probably the last time we'll see the Controller for this specific season. But in the end, everything works out as Rick Jones is able to tell Hulk that Iron Man is saved, and that the real threat is the Controller, and Tony is pretty much able to arrest the Controller, with Iron Man finding a friend in Hulk, and with Hulk actually finding a friend in Pepper Potts, and Pepper realizing that Team Iron Man, at the end of the day, ain't so bad after all.
Hulk like Pepper. Pepper funny.
Alright, next episode. I hope you're not sick of Madame Mask yet, because we have once again another episode centered around her. Now, you see, Madame Mask, or Whitney, has been having severe hallucinations recently. Those majority of them being of her dad, basically berating her for being terrible. Now, Whitney is having these hallucinations and is getting extremely sick. And so she decides to put on the mask once again in an attempt to confront her father and basically kill him, because she is going insane by seeing him everywhere, constantly threatening her and Tony, who she loves very deeply. Now, she ends up getting caught because she is sick and sloppy, only for Obadiah to realize that Madame Mask is her daughter using a stolen piece of technology from the Stark Vault. But he also realizes that his daughter is extremely sick. Now, Obadiah Stane is a lot of things. He's a terrible person, he's a terrible businessman, and just overall is terrible. Like, he's just bad. I wish I could say some stronger words, but YouTube does YouTube things. Regardless, Obadiah does at least have one thing going for him, and that's the fact that he cares about his daughter a lot. He actually loves his daughter, even if he barely shows it or just doesn't outright show it at all. And so he actually comes to Tony Stark hoping for his help in saving Whitney. And of course, Tony agrees because he loves Whitney. He cares about her a lot.
Oh, nuts.
When did you...
This is what is causing my daughter's sickness. Your father invented it, and no one can understand what it is. Tony, I need your help.
Now, Tony, because he's a legitimate genius, is able to pretty easily and quickly determine what her illness is and how exactly to fix it, but basically warns against using the Madame Mask again or any time in the future, as it may cause genuine permanent brain damage, i.e. that in memory. Basically, from when she started using the mask to the current moment in time, she would lose her memory. Now, Tony needs one singular thing in order to make this cure, and it happens to be in the Arctic, and we are once again going to get introduced to a gimmick suit that I love so much that barely shows up after its first appearance, that being the Arctic suit, which is just so awesome. It's basically using technology Tony had originally used his first time fighting Blizzard in order to make a really great suit. And Obadiah has another way of trying to get this, by basically threatening to blow up Blizzard's brain if he does not go help his daughter, and you get that piece of technology from the Arctic. Now, of course, because Obadiah Stane isn't exactly very smart, Blizzard is very easily able to get rid of the one insurance policy Obadiah came up with, because basically when tech hits sub-zero, it stops working, and that's quite literally Blizzard's power set. That leaves Tony and Blizzard having to duke it out, all so that they can potentially save Whitney. Thankfully, this suit is actually built to deal with Blizzard, and while all that's going down in the Arctic, Whitney has literally escaped the hospital because she does not remember anything and has put the mask back on because she's afraid that Tony is going to get attacked by her father again, because Whitney is flat out losing her memory. Now, it's worth noting that Blizzard has at this point taken the jet and is flying all the way back to New York to get revenge on Obadiah Stane. All of this is going on while, mind you, Whitney is quite literally dying. She will die fairly soon if Tony does not get the medicine that is needed for her. And all of this is not helping anybody's case when Blizzard is trying to assassinate Obadiah Stane. And to make things even worse, when Blizzard's dealt with, Whitney tries to kill her own dad again in an attempt to protect Tony. But when it's all said and done, and Whitney is going to be saved, Obadiah's still alive, Tony finally reveals to Whitney that he is Iron Man. It's finally something Tony does to open up to her, but unfortunately it is far too late.
Tony!
I lost the ore.
Isn't there anything we can do?
She risked her life to save mine. Now I need to do the same for her.
So with Tony losing the ore, the only way he could save her is using what is left in his heart. Tony used the piece of his heart that is keeping him alive in his implant to save Whitney's life. But unfortunately in the process, the brain damage had caught up to her, and she literally doesn't remember anything before enrolling at the same high school as Tony, effectively wiping their relationship clean, their romantic relationship, and any sort of superhero relationship they had, wiping it all away in one fell swoop, which has to just be heartbreaking for Tony. Now, with all of that said, we're getting to the last two-parter finale of this first season, and we're gonna get back on track with the Makluan rings. This episode starts with, of course, Team Iron Man plus Jean all looking for how to find the next fifth and what they believe to be final Makluan ring, all before, you know, the Mandarin can find it and gets all powerful and everything. But before any of that can happen, when Jean does leave and head back to where the 10 Rings hideout is, he is confronted by the 10 Rings and his newly freed stepfather as the 10 Rings turn against him and take the rings around his neck off and hand them to Jean's stepfather. Now Jean's stepdad is in possession of 3 of the 5 rings. And while that's going on, Team Iron Man is actually taking a moment to look back at the Mandarin's past. We actually get to see the mantle of the Mandarin has been passed down from generation to generation, and even dates as far back as the Aztec times, which is where they believe the 5th and final ring is being held. And when both Tony and Pepper had decided to return to the armory after being done with their research, what they end up finding is that the 10 Rings is there looking to kidnap Tony Stark, as Tony was proprietarily the person who would help Jean Con the most when it came to searching for the Makluan rings. Now, they are able to successfully capture both Tony and Pepper, but ironically enough, and what they don't know at this point, is that Tony is Iron Man. And so in capturing him and in blowing up his lab, they inadvertently destroy a majority of Tony's Iron Man armors and projects, all by accident, which is all going to be seen by Rhodey, who decided to hang back and do a little bit more research at the library. And this decision quite literally saved him from being kidnapped and pretty much saved the rest of Team Iron Man. So yeah, there is that. Of course, Rhodey is extremely concerned when he tries to contact Tony and Pepper, and he really can't, only to find out that they're both being held in captivity by the 10 Rings, all while the armory is up in smoke and Rhodey's worried about his mother. And then we get a funny scene of Pepper, who is just more than happy that she was right that Jean Con's stepdad is evil.
The Mandarin is my stepfather, Zhang.
Are you kidding me? That's exactly what I was talking about when we first met!
Pepper.
Remember? I said Jean's stepfather was a suspected criminal, that he was supposed to be the head of the Tong. Oh, the FBI were right! So were the Magia, for that matter.
Pepper!
Wait, Jean, you knew?
No.
Jean, of course, lies about knowing about his stepfather being the Mandarin and his involvement with the Tong, who I just now realize I've been calling the 10 Rings this entire video. I'm not gonna change that, I'll just be honest with you all. But regardless, they are all being kidnapped by the Tong and, of course, Jean's stepfather, Zhang, all to be forced to pass the next trial to get the 5th and final ring for the Mandarin. Did I mention that Jean's stepdad also has the 4th ring because he took that off of Tony Stark's possession when he kidnapped him? And while Jean and Tony are both trying to figure out how to deal with the brand new puzzle that is presented with them inside of this trial chamber, Rhodey is actually back at the armory. Rhodey is in the armory trying to find any armor that he can theoretically salvage in order to hopefully save Tony and Pepper along with Jean. And this will be the first episode that Rhodey actually finds his own armor mixed throughout the armory. Oh, and Tony and Jean kind of woke up Fin Fang Foom, and now they have to fight for their survival against Fin Fang Foom, with no help from Jean's uncle, who currently has all of his Mandarin rings, because, you know, that's gonna be a very easy fight. Regardless, this is the first time we ever see Rhodey suited up as War Machine. Now, this show doesn't have my favorite War Machine design, but there are parts of it that I thoroughly enjoy, such as the red interface, but I also really enjoy kind of the bulkiness of it, but that's also why I don't like it as much as well. Now, regardless, Rhodey is ready to take both his suit and Tony's suit all the way to South America except in order to do this, he has to enter orbit because it would take about 16 hours for him to fly there due to the fact that the War Machine suit is quite literally not built for long-term flying. It is not a very fast suit. It is heavy, bulky, and ready for action, not for speedy flight. And while Rhodey's focused on that, Pepper was able to take the gauntlet off of the Mandarin Masquerader, and as she was trying to get it over to Jean, Fin Fang Foom once again intervenes and is trying to kill Team Iron Man plus Jean. All this while Rhodey is trying to get to South America as fast as possible, going into space to do so, where his suit quite literally gives up on him and completely resets due to not being built for deep space atmosphere. And that's where episode 1 ended. It ended on a cliffhanger, and I'm just of course going to quickly jump into episode 2 for everybody here who, doesn't want to wait. Now, Rhodey is able to regain control of his armor and basically free fall into orbit with Iron Man's using Tony's armor as a propulsion unit to his, and inexplicably his entire HUD turns to Iron Man's colors rather than his own suit's red color. I don't 100% know why this happened, but hey, it did. So just when things were looking at their most dire, when it looked like Team Iron Man was on their last leg against Fin Fang Foom, Rhodey came in clutch for the millionth time this season to save the day. And in the process, Jean finally learns that the man he calls a friend and has been working with this whole time is his arch nemesis, Iron Man.
What took you so long?
Don't ask. You guys okay?
Rhodes? You're Iron Man? No. That's what I was trying to tell you on the plane. I'm Iron Man.
Now, we get a really cool team-up scene of both Rhodey and Iron Man for the first time, and what would come to be a majority of the time when Season 2 hits. It's a fairly cool fight scene. But while all of that is going on, Jean is finally untethered from any sort of responsibility he felt to be a half-decent person, mainly because he feels as though his friends just betrayed him. And so he, of course, wants to fulfill his destiny. He has 4 of the rings in his possession currently, and the 5th one is right within reach. He is so close to being able to build the great world he believes he should be able to make. So when Fin Fang Foom is finally defeated and dealt with, the team first starts to mourn the potential loss of Jean, as he was technically eaten by Fin Fang Foom, only to find out that Jean not only lived, but is the one who just saved them, because Jean is the Mandarin. Which, of course, is an extreme shock to Tony and an extreme blow to him, as the Mandarin has quite literally not only been his best friend, but has also taken a majority of the things in Tony's life. As a matter of fact, without Jean and without the Mandarin, Tony wouldn't even be Iron Man. He wouldn't have a heart problem, and he wouldn't have lost his father. And to think the Mandarin was so close the entire time, being his quite literal one of his closest and only friends in his high school.
My entire life has been leading up to this moment. One ring was power enough to begin my journey. But with all 5 rings, my journey is complete.
But just when things started to seem even between both Iron Man and the Mandarin pulled out one last final. He tried to convince Tony that his father is still alive and that if he keeps fighting the Mandarin, Tony will never figure out where his father is.
Turns out I took the wrong Stark. Now let me go, or you'll never find him.
Now this obviously leaves Tony rattled. He pretty much hasn't been able to function properly the last few days, as he was severely injured in the fight against Jean. He's pretty much just been hanging out at home and resting, while Team Iron Man are somewhat celebrating their current victory, despite the fact that they lost one of their close friends that they all believed in, and as well that the revelation that Tony may or may not have his father alive due to the fact that Jean isn't always the reliable narrator. Now, of course, for Jean, this is also frustrating because he was told that after 5 rings were found, he would be granted ultimate power. But this is where we find out that there are actually 10 rings, not 5. And that's where the show leaves us for the first season, on a cliffhanger ending to get us ready for season 2. So that's it. That is the first season of Iron Man Armored Adventures. And honestly, I am very biased about this show because it's extremely, extremely nostalgic for me. I would watch this show growing up after elementary school, and to me, it was amazing. Now, the 3D animation nowadays has not held up to the standards I remember it as when I was a kid, but I don't think it looked bad for the time either, and I don't think it looks terrible nowadays. This show really introduced me to Iron Man's wider range of villains, and they did a wonderful job at showing Iron Man's really rogues gallery, something that most shows don't really do. Definitely something the Iron Man movies did not do, was really broaden and open up his rogues gallery. I mean, we got Killer Shrike and Rhino, for example. Like, that to me was great. We also got some really great gem characters like Living Laser. Overall, I think this was a really good first season of television that was done fairly well, even if the character arcs were fairly lacking, to be honest. Well, anyways, I just want to take a second to thank you all for watching, as I really appreciate your guys' support, especially on the first Iron Man Adventures video, because that one is doing very well. So thank you all for watching. Now, if you've made it this far in the video, I just want to say, if you can leave me a like, please leave me a like. It's free, and it just helps out push the video, helps out the channel. If you want to dislike, please dislike the video and then comment below letting me know why you didn't like the video and what I could have done better in the future. Now, if you really enjoy the content, or maybe this is the first video you found and you really enjoy it, please consider giving me a sub. It's free and you can unsubscribe later. As well, I do run a Patreon, which helps me to get these videos out on a more consistent basis. As well, you will get to see each and every one of these videos unedited and as well unfiltered, so you can really get my thoughts behind how I want to make these videos without any edits for copyright and monetization reasons here on YouTube. Now, I do also offer multiple tiers on Patreon, and I also shout out every single one of my viewers who are in the $5 tier every single month at the end of every video. So that is going to be Donovan Gomez, Golden Boy 420, MC Bomb 27, and Dakota Rawson. So thank you all for your continual support on my channel. Appreciate you all, and I hope you have an absolutely fantastic day.